Hey there, welcome back to Point of Sale, the retail supply chain show where we break down great retailers, the supply chains that move them, and the data they use to make decisions. I'm your host, Andrew Cox, a senior retail analyst here at FreightWaves, and today we are speaking with one of those companies that keeps supply chains moving. They happen to be my headline sponsor of the show as well, that is ArcBest. I have the distinct pleasure of speaking with Dennis Anderson. He's the Chief Customer Officer at ArcBest. Dennis, thanks for joining me, and thanks for coming.
Well, thanks, Andrew. It's always a privilege to be with FreightWaves and great to be on your show today.
So Dennis, ArcBest is a big company that does a lot more than LTL, but ABF is one of those signature brands within the ArcBest portfolio. So I wanted to start with LTL when we're speaking about e-commerce, because we've seen a lot of influx of demand from e-commerce flow into LTL out of truckload, and LTL provides this unique opportunity to be agile and flexible with loads. So where does LTL fit into the e-commerce landscape?
Sure. Well, great question, Andrew. And I totally agree with you. I think uh, flexible and agile, those are words that I think everyone has gotten really, really familiar with over the last few months. And LTL is a great mode for that. And as we think about what happens in the supply chain when e-commerce is involved, there's probably a final mile component that's a lot of times delivery to home, but it might be BOPIS or some other endpoint to that e-commerce transaction. But LTL can play a role really in any part of that supply chain. As you mentioned, our LTL carrier here at ArcBest is ABF, and ABF has done home deliveries for many, many years. Not a lot of LTL carriers really had started off into that. I think more and more in the last few years have gotten involved where they're making these home deliveries with their own equipment. But that's one place where LTL plays a role. And then if you back up really kind of into the middle mile, where there's shipping to DCs or from DCs to stores, there's quite a bit of LTL at play there. And it really kind of just depends on the specific product that's moving, the retailer that's involved. Those can definitely involve LTL, and really, first mile even we've seen business in the first mile. So all through that, LTL plays a role, and because of the unique nature of e-commerce, LTL really kind of plays a unique role for that, because what it's doing, e-commerce by definition really is moving that endpoint to the consumer a lot of times. And so when you're having dispersion of the endpoints like that, it requires smaller shipment quantities, and LTL is great for that. And a lot of times LTL is going to play a role for heavy or bulkier items, not necessarily your parcel items that you'd think of as maybe everyday kind of deliveries in e-commerce. But they're gonna play a role for largely heavier or bulkier items as well.
So Dennis, let's talk about two facets of this. This is equipment that is used to deliver the goods, and also the velocity with which goods are delivered. Because e-commerce, and we can thank Amazon for this, but they keep pushing and pushing for faster and faster delivery, even if it's something as big as a treadmill or a ping pong table. So how do you guys think about what equipment is necessary to move through residential places as you're making home deliveries? And how does the velocity, the ever-changing, ever-faster delivery impact where you position freight, where you position equipment?
Sure. Well, I think the first question on the equipment is you definitely want equipment that can fit into a residential neighborhood, or if you're in a metro area, doesn't take up a whole lot of room on the street. So you're looking at things like straight trucks in a lot of situations, or traditional LTL fleets have had pup trailers, which are the 28-foot variety, which maybe if you're driving down the interstate, you'll see two of them together for a set of pups. But those 28 footers are typically easier to maneuver into a neighborhood. And so you'll see either the straight trucks or the pups typically in a neighborhood. Now, some LTL fleets only have 53s or 48s, and so they'll try to navigate those down in the neighborhoods, and I guess it can be done. But most ideally, you're either talking about straight trucks or pups. The other thing that's really important for home delivery a lot of times is liftgate, because you're not typically going to come to a home that has a dock. That's not a normal thing. And so most of these trailers are built off the ground enough to bump a dock. And so lift gate is pretty important in that, because you need to be able to get the heavier, bulky item down to the ground for the delivery at the residence. So lift gates, pup trailers, straight trucks are typically things that show up in those neighborhoods. And then the second question you asked was about velocity, and I think one thing that's clear, consumers, we're all consumers, and we want things yesterday, and so there's always going to be this push for faster velocity through the supply chain. And I think the logistics providers that are able to deliver that are really, really critical. I think I saw a quote from a retailer today, actually, that just talked about the shift to same day delivery for them is one of the fastest logistics shifts they'd seen in their entire career. And so, same day delivery is a big deal. And so there's definitely a push for greater velocity, and some networks can keep up with that. Some, it's going to be a struggle. And so I think there's just always going to be an evolution going on, and really a race for providers with networks, particularly to increase that velocity while keeping cost reasonable. That's the other thing. If you're going to increase velocity, you're generally going to increase cost. And so the retailers are grappling with that. How do you deal with the increase in cost to increase the velocity to satisfy your consumer? And so I think that's one of those things that we're going to continue to watch play out, because someone's going to have to bear that cost, because it is more costly.
I think you're exactly right, Dennis, when you talk about the costs of faster and faster fulfillment. And it seemed to me that I don't think Americans are going to be as willing to pay for same day delivery or deliver by shipped or deliv or whatever gig economy courier is doing so. Do you feel that way? Do you think there's going to be the same demand for same day delivery post COVID, when people can go back into stores and pick it up on their own?
I think that if costs are passed on to consumers in the way that they actually exist, or some close level to what the costs actually are, I think you're right. I think it's a definite struggle for the consumer to ultimately bear that cost. And so what you've seen is either retailers or the provider, especially in a startup scenario, maybe is eating that cost as their marketing to get off the ground, if you will. And so, but that cost is somewhere. It's going to someone at some point.
Right, so that's why I think about these companies that are subsidizing even curbside pickup and BOPIS. Think about Walmart and Target. It takes additional manpower to ensure that you can create those operations, and it's free to pick up curbside. But it seems like, in my mind, that is going to be the long-term winner of this, because the everyday stop at Walmart or Kroger, especially for home household essentials and grocery, is that the everyday Walmart or Kroger or Target run was already in people's routine. So you can cut that routine time bound by 90% and at no additional cost. So it seems like that will be a long-term winner, and I don't think BOPIS is going anywhere. So with that in mind, what does the increased usage of BOPIS do to a carrier like yourself? Are you guys running more middle mile operations? How is that impacting you?
Well, it definitely in the middle mile, there's still a need for that in a BOPIS type situation. And first of all, I totally agree with you. I think BOPIS is one of those things that it's here to stay, and consumers really have gravitated toward that, because it's a good balance of that cost and convenience answer. And a lot of times that stock already is theoretically already in stock at the store. And so it feels like a same day kind of operation for a consumer. But to answer your other question, it does really still drive things like LTL in the middle mile. So, a dispersion of endpoints, as we talked about earlier, kind of demand points, happens at a great scale with home delivery, but it still happens at some scale when you have, especially big box retailers that have thousands of stores across the country. That's a different thing than being able to consolidate truckloads, unless you're, the largest of the big box retailers. Most store endpoints in a just a normal flow of their product aren't receiving necessarily full truckloads of specific items every day. So that really does create a position for LTL. On the other hand, you talked at the top about us being a logistics company that does more than LTL. When we have truckload and expedite modes that allow us really to serve any piece of that. So we are seeing more expedite for sure, really kind of in that line haul, middle mile. Also, truckload in the retail space is still there. It's still alive and it's still strong. And so I think it's just a case of you're seeing more LTL, which it's a smaller market than truckload, so it tends to smaller movements can be greater felt in that LTL market as well. So you're seeing that for sure, even in a BOPIS kind of environment.
So, Dennis, I saw an article this morning, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, that talked about how direct-to-consumer models that retailers are taking on now, they're moving away from wholesale and more towards more direct-to-consumer models. The shift is being led by the biggest brands in the world, the Adidas, Nike, and Under Armour, but they're moving towards more direct-to-consumer models. And what this creates is a more demand for actually Adidas, Nike, or Under Armour branded stores. So the article in the Wall Street Journal basically said that in 2021, it's the first year in I think more than a decade that we're expecting more retail openings, store openings, than expected store closures. And so this leads on the point of dispersion of endpoints. As you said, it's a much more dispersed endpoint when you're going to homes, but the same is happening when you're going from retailers to brands owning their own stores. So the way the next thing I want to talk about is how LTL in particular, but all modes of transportation have always focused on creating density in networks. So with these dispersion points, spreading out and density kind of unraveling, how do you guys think about still creating density, balancing density and meeting customers where they're at?
Absolutely. Well, you said a really key word that we work toward, and I think most supply chain managers work toward, is density. And I think one of the challenges of a supply chain manager is thinking about their entire supply chain and thinking about how they can create that density, because it's generally more efficient to move things together that can go together for as long as they can go together and get to that endpoint. But to your point, this proliferation of more stores, just in a broader demand footprint, is going to drive smaller shipment quantities in general. Now, you're going to have some situations where truckload's going to make sense right into the back of that Adidas branded store, if you will. But at the same time, you're wanting to be more nimble and agile. You can't keep a whole lot of inventory in the back room of one of those smaller stores. And so that is definitely going to drive mode selection to an LTL type quantity generally, for the proliferation of stores like that at a greater scale. So I think it definitely, to your point, drives LTL. But there are definitely opportunities for these other modes, either back in the middle mile, or if there's density, like you said, in these certain lanes, that it definitely can drive truckload or expedite or other larger mode kind of or larger quantity kind of modes.
Dennis, supply chains have been upended because of COVID at every end of the supply chain, from raw materials to home delivery. And it seems that demand planning has been something that's been very difficult for the industry, both on supplier side and on the transportation side throughout COVID. So I wanted to ask you whether you think the the challenge of demand planning in our industry is a structural issue that was highlighted by COVID, or is it something that was caused by COVID?
That's a great question. And I think I'm going to take the middle ground and say it might be a structural condition that was exacerbated by COVID. I think always you're trying to understand, what demand looks like. And I think for many supply chain managers, that looked like relying on historical data and models from seasonality, for example. How much of this product am I going to need during this season? And so I'm going to build up my inventory 3 months in advance. Well, I mean, now with what's happened with COVID, not only the e-commerce change, but then just the change in housing and mobility and what people are doing in their lives. Just as you talk about kind of as a behavior change at the consumer level, that's really just completely changed the demand dynamics. Planners don't know what inventory they need where, when, and are these products just flying off the shelf in this location just because that's what's on the shelf at that location, or is that really what consumers wanted at that location? And so I think COVID really just exacerbated the problem in that now you don't have good history to rely on. And I think 2021, what does seasonality look like? And especially, how are you going to compare to last year? And so I just think there are so many factors that have just created this problem for planners that are trying to create that density, trying to be efficient, trying to plan ahead, and trying to get things to the point where the consumer needs them when they need them. And I think that's just the nature of the pandemic changed everything from the behavior of consumers at the end of the supply chain, all the way through what the supply chain is capable of, just because of COVID protocols, just behavior of workers and where they want to spend their days, in what industry. So it just changed what's possible in the supply chain itself, but also is changing for manufacturers. Being able to actually produce the product, and then what product to produce. So I mean, it's been a complete disruption and largely driven by behavior change at every level of supply chain. But then that creates the issue, like you said, of planners not being able to look at data in the way that we've looked at data in years past. It's really much more of an agile, to overuse that word. It's more of an agile process where you're having to come in today and figure out what you need where and when based on what behaviors look like today. And COVID has definitely accelerated that.
I think that's a brilliant point, how the behaviors changed seemingly overnight on the end of the supply chain, and how it forced the entire supply chain at every level to rethink what they're capable of. And I mean, if we're being honest, I think supply chains in America, across the globe, but especially in America, have done an incredible job of making sure that products got to customer. Of course, we've seen delays. Some products have taken months to get there, whether it be furniture or exercise equipment in the case of Peloton, but things have gotten there eventually, and the supply chain has kept the economy moving. But when it comes back to thinking of planning forward and trying to plan ahead, have you guys seen an uptick in forward placement of product in warehousing? How has that changed with e-commerce when people are thinking about getting product to consumers faster? Have you guys have your customers changed the way that they place product?
Well, I think just it's been a complete shift. I mean, for people to think. And first of all, I want to kind of reflect back on the first part of your setup there on just the resiliency of the supply chain and the resiliency of the people in the supply chain. I think is incredible. And it's enabled by a lot of people with a lot of tenacity, all the way through from folks like our company, our drivers, dock workers, our customer service people, our sales people. I mean, everyone's living a very different life right now, and to be so resilient through this is amazing. And so I want to recognize that and not miss that point that you made on how incredible it is that the supply chains have survived through this. But I think the other thing is, to highlight some of the creativity. It's really a benefit when you have supply chain providers, for example, that can have a lot of different options. And I know we've been with our customers saying, hey, we'll find a way. Whatever we need to do, that's actually our vision. Whatever we need to do, if it's right to move this LTL today, if it's right to push it into warehousing. I mean, we've had a lot of conversations about just reconfiguring how our customer supply chains work, and so we're definitely seeing more and more of those conversations. Our managed uh, solutions business has actually been one of the fastest growing pieces of our business for a while. And that just has accelerated because consumers or retailers are having this kind of discussion, but also vendors, suppliers of retailers are having this kind of discussion. How do I set this up, and should I create a different demand point? Should I move things around? But what I would say is, uh, it's different uh, by company. The supply chains are very different. They're unique. A lot of companies use their supply chain as a competitive weapon, and so one retailer might look very different from the next retailer. And so I wouldn't say that there's this massive trend that we're seeing one way or another. In terms of inventory right now, it's just a mad scramble to get it. And so I think if you look at where inventories are, they're very low. Retailers need inventory, and so right now it's pretty much all hands on deck. Whatever situation you can find to get the inventory in stock, it's not so much about storing it up at this point. It's just getting it on the shelf.
I see. That makes sense. Dennis, next time we speak, we'll have to do something on port congestion and inventory levels because I'm sure we could go on for an hour just on inventories alone. I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on how e-commerce changes the way that retailers look at inventories, but we will save that for another day. I want to ask one last question before you go, and I hate to belabor the point of learnings because it does seem like what you've been telling me over the past year is that ArcBest has learned and adjusted a lot over the last year. But let's just to finish it, what have been the main takeaways, the main learnings that you and your company have taken over the last year with COVID, and what are you taking forward with you into the future?
Yeah, absolutely, great question, Andrew. And I will say I'll reflect back on what I said, just the resiliency of, first of all, within our company, our people has been incredible, and just seeing how people have adapted and adjusted and just continue to serve customers, continue to serve the supply chain, continue to make pickups and deliveries. I mean, in an environment like this where there are concerns over health and making sure everyone's safe, but then you know being able to go make things happen on a day-to-day basis. Our sales force being able to connect with customers in unique ways, where whether it's over video or staying in touch via text, whatever, designing supply chains and not ever even sitting in the room together. It's pretty amazing. And so I think we've learned that we can do a whole lot more things than we ever dreamed without our comfort zone. And so that's one big learning that I'd take away from this. And so the resiliency of our company is something I'm very, very proud of, and of our people, very, very proud of. And the agility too. I mean, for our company, we came into the pandemic about a year ago really looking at a steep decline in business. And so we made a lot of changes quickly to really make sure that we weren't burning cash that we needed to preserve. And then as things recovered, thankfully those things started to recover in the back half of last year, and we were able to restore some of those actions. And just seeing that just come back so quickly, I think was a blessing and a great thing to see. And so the other thing that so those are great learnings about our company and our people. The other thing I think is just that the will of the consumer to continue spending and continue and just shift behavior, but continue to live their life through something like this is pretty amazing. I mean, the shift to e-commerce, we talked about it at the top. That's been a big learning, but there's still a lot of runway there. I mean, we haven't eclipsed from the Census Bureau's perspective for a year. We still haven't eclipsed 15% of total retail sales being e-commerce yet. So a lot of movement there, but a lot of runway to go. And I think just at the end of the day, that resiliency and agility are the things that I take away most from this pandemic, from our company's perspective, and then just looking at supply chains and the consumer in general.
Dennis, I am so glad you said that because I've written about it back over the summer during the middle of COVID. I wrote that you cannot doubt the American consumer, especially with free money. You give us a little bit of stimulus, I promise you we will spend it. It is the one thing we know best. And I also wanted to comment on the fact that, you were talking about how execution and how you guys have been agile and flexible. And it's just the idea that talk is cheap. You can say you're going to do these things, but you have to execute and you have to be there for your customers and you have to continue to build relationships, even in the deepest and darkest of times that we went through in the middle of last year. And I know you guys did that. So thank you for your hard work to keep the economy moving and keep America moving. But I also wanted to give you a moment, give all the retailers and everyone listening a place to go. Where should they go to find more about ArcBest and your services?
Sure. Well, thanks, Andrew. And if anyone's looking to connect with us for further conversation, you can reach us at arcb.com. I'm on LinkedIn. We've got a number of representatives there on LinkedIn as well that you can reach out to. But arcb.com is our web presence, and we'd be happy to talk to you more. And Andrew, I just appreciate you and FreightWaves. Thanks again for having me on today, and looking forward to speaking with you more, and looking forward to speaking with anyone in the audience that would like to chat further.
Absolutely, Dennis. I have learned a ton today. I'm sure people listening have as well. Everyone, you can always get every podcast and an audio show that FreightWaves puts out in one feed on Freightcast. You can find that anywhere you listen to podcasts, on Spotify or Apple Music. You can also subscribe to Point of Sale Show on its own, the same places. Anywhere you listen to podcasts, just search Point of Sale. And lastly, please sign up for the Point of Sale newsletter, which is also sponsored by ArcBest. You can find that at freightwaves.com/POS. Very easy to sign up and get some of the archived posts there, as well as some of the archived episodes. I'm talking about retail supply chains twice weekly, Mondays and Thursdays. All right, that's been it for episode 7 of the Point of Sale Show, the retail supply chain show where we break down great retailers, the supply chains that move them, and the data they use to make decisions. See you next week.